Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the UC Center Sacramento Weekly Speaker Series. Welcome. We have something old and something new today. The old is that we continue addressing themes of public health, homelessness, and chronic mental illness, and today, drought and extreme heat. The new is obviously we're here, and those of you who are with us in person, we're in a new building, a brand new home for UC Center Sacramento. So pretty exciting to be here. I'm sure that we'll have some tech failures along the way, but we'll muscle through those. So today, as I mentioned, we're gonna focus on our theme of drought and extreme heat, and in particular, ways in which forests can be restored even after cycles of drought, flooding, heat, and fire. To address this topic, we turn to perhaps a lesser-known corner of the university because in addition to the 10 campuses and 3 national laboratories, UC has an entire division called Agriculture and Natural Resources. It's an outgrowth of UC's status as a land-grant university and part of our public service mission. The purpose is to bring the power of UC research and education to all 58 California counties. The group does this through 150 advisors, 260 community educators, 13 statewide programs, 120 campus specialists, 9 extension centers, and 19,281 volunteers. I'm sure they would take more if anyone's interested. Susie Coker is a California registered professional forester and a forestry and natural resources advisor. As such, she's been an extension forester for the Central Sierra since 2006, focusing on forest resilience from wildfire, drought, and other disturbances. Her work includes applied research, outreach, and education on forest stewardship. She also directs a statewide forest stewardship education program, a post-fire education program, and she started 2 new prescribed burn associations. Ms. Coker holds a BA from the University of Iowa and a master's in forestry from the University of Washington. She's the author of numerous reports in both the peer-reviewed and the public literature, and she'll speak today on restoring forest resilience after wildfires on private land. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to have had a chance to meet with the students before giving this talk, and thank you for being here. As the introduction said, I work for the University of California Cooperative Extension in the Central Sierra. That's 4 counties: El Dorado, Amador, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties, a lot of forests in those regions. I have lived in the Sierra Nevada in forested counties for 30 years, 13 years outside of Greenville in Plumas County, and now 17 years in the Sierra, in South Lake Tahoe. So I am going to tell you about kind of reflections on forestry over the last 30 years and where we're at, how we got there, all of those things. Here's my outline. I'm going to tell you a little bit about California forests, who owns them, how we're experiencing a lot more large-scale disturbances, the overwhelming need for reforestation, how small landowners experience wildfires, what they need for assistance to reforest, and the state response to forest loss. So I wanted to start with these maps. These are from the CAL FIRE Forest Resource Assessment Program from 2017. And they basically show you on the left vegetation types in California and ownership on the right. So you see in the left-hand map, vegetation types. So I'm going to look at this one over here. Conifer forest is kind of this wishbone going up the Sierra. We got the redwood country over here. We have a bathtub ring of oak woodlands around the Central Valley. And then we're down into herbaceous and shrubs with the Central Valley in the center, desert areas on the side. Distribution according to precipitation and temperature of different types of vegetation. If you look at who owns what, the private land ownership here is in yellow, and you'll see up on the north coast, this is conifer forest, this is the redwoods, a lot of private ownership, non-industrial and industrial timber companies. And then a lot of the higher elevation is public forest that's owned, administered by the Forest Service, and Park Service is there in the purple, right? So the private landowners are in yellow, and in the Sierra Nevada, it's mostly oak woodland and then up into the conifer system, but not at highest elevation. So overall, who owns the forest in California? Here's some numbers you should keep in mind. California has 100 million acres, which makes it very easy for the math. 32 million acres are forested, so that's a third of the state is covered in some kind of forest, which means there's 10% cover by trees or more. So oak woodlands would be considered forests, not just conifer forests, as would pinyon juniper on the east side and other things like that. So 32, about a third is forested. Of that, 19 million acres is public and administered by federal agencies that I just pointed out, and 12 million acres are owned privately. So 5 million of those are industrial timber companies. The largest landowner in California is Sierra Pacific Industries, an industrial timber company that sells wood as their primary business model. And then 7 million acres, more than industrial timber ownership, is owned by private individuals. So in the literature, they're called non-industrial private forest landowners, but I don't really like to talk to people and tell them they're not something. So instead of using NIPF as an abbreviation, generally I call them family forest owners. They may have a family LLC, but they don't have their own mill. They're just a family that owns forest land. And 90% of them that own forest land own less than 50 acres. So they don't have a large amount of staff. They don't have any staff. They may have inherited it. They may not know a lot about forestry. That's not an acreage where you, in most cases, could sell timber and have an ongoing income, unless you potentially live in redwood country, which is very valuable. So almost everything they do on their property is an out-of-pocket expense, which means you're not using it for your retirement, you're not taking a vacation, you're spending it to do work on your property with little expectation of return. Okay, so that's who owns it. A little bit about forests in California. And since I'm a Sierra forester, that's where I'm gonna focus. Basically, we have frequent fire forests. So our forests were adapted to frequent low severity fires. So you see the picture on the right, that's a low severity fire burning through the forest, burning up some vegetation, burning up some fuels, not necessarily killing trees. And historically, both natural and anthropogenic starts, or started by native people, were burning through the forest. Our native folks managed the landscape for probably at least 10,000 years before colonization. And a lot of those practices, at least in the Sierra, were maintained until after the gold rush. After the gold rush, there was a period of practiced genocide, removing people from the landscape. And those people were not there managing the forests anymore. These are some books I really recommend. Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson is the whole story of how Native people have managed the landscape through ethnographies. She was an anthropologist. Forgotten Fires is the story of that all over the country and how the landscape was managed before colonization. And then American Genocide is a new book that came out in 2017 that describes that period after the gold rush. And it will give you an idea of the scale of population removal. And It's a hard book, but it took me a whole year to read, but it's important to understand the state of population and forests, in my opinion. Oh, shoot. Wrong button. There we go. Okay. So here's a pocket of white fir in a forest. This was the first prescribed burn I ever held, and this is a low severity fire, right? So you can see that there's some young trees. They're getting burned up because there's a fire. It's not necessarily going to touch those trees next to it. If it does, it might cause a little scar on the bole of the tree, but it's not of a scale that's going to kill the forest. And as a basis of that, sometimes you get a burn scar. So the fire went through, it burned the tree. This is a tree cookie. It's a cross section. And every burn scar then here has an arrow to it, and it's been dated to when the fire went by. So here was a fire that went by. Do you see that little crack there? That is what a tree does. If it's not killed, it grows over and heals the wound. So there's one in 1797, 1802, 1810, 1816. You can see, 6 years, 4 years, it's a very frequent fire going by. So we have a lot of great data like this for all of our forest systems in California. And we have a lot of certainty about the amount of frequent low severity fire that went through. Some of the other veg types we know less about. Shrubs don't do that, and herbaceous stuff. But based on ethnographies, we can make estimates by talking to Native people about how they burned, of how frequent fire was coming through. So what you would do is say, okay, 7 years, and here's one 10 years, and here's one 15 years, and you would add those up and divide by 3, and then you come up with this metric called the fire return interval. So that's the time between 2 successive fires at a given site, but it's actually an average. And so here is just some average FRIs for Sierra Nevada forests. So the brown is every 11 years. You see a map there. As you go up higher in elevation, the fire return interval is farther apart. You have less high temperatures, so it doesn't dry out for as much during the season. Things don't grow as quickly, so it takes longer to fuel and accumulate fires at higher elevation. So you had a pattern of different time frames going through and cleaning out debris on the forest floor and killing small trees so that they didn't grow up and crowd out the forest. There's a great paper from the Stevens Lab at UC Berkeley that looked at all this data and made an estimate before fire suppression and fire exclusion, how many acres used to burn in California per year. And it's between 4 and 12 million acres a year. And you remember I told you there's 100 million acres in California. So we estimate 4 to 12% of the state burned every year before settlement. But you saw the picture I showed you of that fire, right? At low severity, so it wasn't killing all the trees. Here are some pictures from a book called Fire in the Sierra Nevada by a wildlife biologist called George Gruel. And he did a photo sequence repeating project. And here is his follow-up photo of Spalding Lake in Nevada County. That would be off of Interstate 80 if you go towards Reno. There it is in 1919, had never been logged. That sort of density is what's produced by a frequent fire regime. And on the right is after fire suppression. So you can see a lot of densification. All those small trees were not burned and grew up, and there's a lot denser forest there. Here's Yosemite on the left, 1866, and then in 1961, 100 years later, you can see without fires, there's a huge densification of the forest. So in a lot of cases, without that natural disturbance that our trees evolved with, we have increased competition between the trees. There's only a certain amount of water and precipitation that lands in one area. So if you have twice as many trees, they each get half as much water, right? And so they're not as healthy, they're competing, and they're more likely to die. They're more susceptible to native bark beetles. And now, because there's so much fuel, they're starting to burn at high severity. There's also other ecological effects, lots of conifer encroachment in meadows and other types of areas that would not have been conquered by the trees in a frequent fire regime. And then on top of that, we have climate change. So we have this complete out-of-kilter fire disturbance regime, and then on top we're having droughts and increased temperature. So this is a picture from April 2015, and then what you see is there every tree that's red is dying from drought or bark beetle. So just over a period of a year in the southern Sierra around Bass Lake, up to, in some areas, 90% of the trees just dying from the drought of 2012 to 16. So we have had droughts. I started my career in California working on drought in 1991, doing salvage timber marking of one of the big droughts. And so it's not uncommon to have droughts, and our native bark beetles are commonly expanding and attacking trees during droughts. So that is a normal process. But what happened was it was so warm, it wasn't a loss of more moisture than normal, but it was a loss of moisture and heat, and a lot of heat. And when plants are hotter, they need more water, not less. So it was a historic amount of stress to our trees. And then over here on the right, you see a map of dead trees, and the southern Sierra was really ground zero. We ended up with 150 million dead trees around the state based on that drought. And concentration in the southern Sierra, there's a transect of precipitation from the north to the south, and so in the south there's normally less moisture as well. Okay. And here's just a little bit of information about the heat. So 2021 was the hottest summer on record and the driest year on record. Obviously, 2023 is good news for all the precipitation that we're getting. It's really good news for those trees who have been struggling, for sure. There had been last year an outbreak as well. The Forest Service monitors, and they found 50 million dead trees last year, so it was an uptick in tree mortality based on that drought. But I expect that this moisture will really help ramp that back, because that's what the trees need to fight off bark beetles. And obviously the one that's most obvious to most of us is that wildfires are becoming almost impossible to contain. So the 2020 fire season was remarkable. On the lower left, you can see just a scale of 2020 and how it looked for acres burned compared to previous years. It was 4.4 million acres. So as you recall, since there's 100 million acres, that's about 4% of the state that burned. And that's starting to get close to historical averages, but at a much higher severity. 2021 was also difficult. It was 2.5 million acres. The Dixie Fire burnt for the first time almost 1 million acres and destroyed the town of Greenville, where I lived for 13 years. And then the Caldor Fire was 220,000 acres that went all the way up and over the Sierra Crest. So it destroyed the community of Grizzly Flats, came up to Tahoe, and we weathered it well, but we were all evacuated for 2 weeks as well. So that was a really big year. For me personally, just 2 hometowns burning down at once would have been too much. I mean, 1 is too much, but luckily it was not 2. Anyway, so there is a new study that came out on the increase in high severity fire. There it is, Williams et al. In 2023, where they've been keeping track of what percentage of wildfires is burning at high severity, which means that all the trees are killed, right? So that's a picture of what we're talking about on the left. Before 1850, cross forest types probably around 7%. It's not nothing, and some of our wildlife species are adapted to dead trees, so it's not unnatural to have areas where pockets of trees all die in a wildfire, but probably about 7% of the total. By 2010, it was 29%, and they've just done the analysis for 2020, and it's now up to about a third of the landscape that's burning is burning at high severity tree, where all the trees are killed. And then when you put it in a coupling with tree die-off from drought, you get a study on the left where the researcher said, quote, 30% of conifer forests in the southern Sierra are no longer considered forests. They're either sparsely treed landscapes or they're transitioning in the short term or long term to a shrubland type system. So our trees are adapted to frequent low severity fires, and to reproduce, they need a standing seed tree. A seed has to fall out of a live tree onto the ground. They don't get kept in the seed bed, and then has to sprout. If you have huge patches of dead trees, there are no seed trees nearby, and so you don't have that opportunity for new seedlings. And then you have other vegetation that is actually competing for that space. And so in some areas, there's a real concern that we're going to have permanent vegetation type to a shrubland ecosystem. Shrubs are great. I'm not trying to be anti-shrub. But if it used to be a forest, I think because we've screwed up the ecosystem so much, we do have an imperative, maybe even I would say a moral imperative, to try and restore a forest where it used to be. Then high severity fire, we are actually getting some areas that are twice baked, that have burned twice now. This is from my colleague, Ryan Tompkins, a forester in Plumas County. It was burned, this is an area that was burned in the 2000 Story fire, so high severity. There's a little bit of recovery there. There's some oaks coming back, but you do see it's mostly dead trees. And then that area burned again in 2012. And so what you see is just dead trees and little ability to regenerate at this point. And with last year, 2 years, they have some areas that have burned 3 times now at high severity. So it's really hard to have forests moving forward doing that. This is a great graphic that I wanted to share from you from Michelle Copolata's article on post-fire vegetation. And it's basically showing you the different trajectories that forests could go. So on the left, you have this initial condition, this fire-excluded mixed conifer forest. There's a lot of vegetation in the understory. It's kind of crowded, and a fire comes. If you're lucky and the weather is not bad, you could still get a low-severity output. So here we've had a burn in that center at the bottom. Still some live trees. A lot of how things burn does have to do with weather and wind and things like that. So you might get to a place where it's done some good work, it's been good fire, and it does restore the forest. But in many cases, what we're getting is this high severity. So you get to this point, and it's killed all the trees. The shrubs come back bountifully, and then with a reburn, then it's just a shrub system. And so there's a couple of different trajectories. I think some people have in their mind that, of course, it's going to grow back. But a lot of how trees and vegetation works has to do with the disturbance that occurred rather than that there's supposed to be something there that will automatically grow back. So that's all to tell you that active reforestation is really needed if we're going to have forests in some areas where there's been high severity fire. So this picture is also from my colleague Ryan. On the left is the Moonlight Fire in Plumas County. That burned in 2007. On the left is private industry, and it's maintained by W.M. Beatty and Associates. They replanted, and 2 years later on the left, you can see young trees. On the right is Forest Service ground, where no treatment was done. So that's the photo on the left is 2 years later. The photo on the right is 10 years after that. So you can see there is a forest returning on the left where the active reforestation was done, and on the right there is not. Foresters, silviculturalists, we call that the wall of shame, because a lot of folks want to do more reforestation, but they don't always have the capacity, the funding, the staff, the ability to get out there and do the treatments needed on federal lands. Here's another one that burned in my community in 2007. That's when I got started working on wildfire issues. The Angora fire, which was a big fire at the time because it burned 250 homes in my community. Here it is in 2014, after nothing was done in this area. It's 6 feet tall of whitethorn, which is a very unpleasant shrub. I told you I was pro-shrub, but I'm not pro this one because it's spiky, it gets in your skin and it festers and you have to have it dug out, and it's not very fun. So personal pet peeve there, whitethorn, it's true. Anyway, the treated area below is on another land ownership. Trees were replanted, and by 2016, they were out competing the shrubs. So there's a good chance you're going to have a forest there in the future. So to be effective, reforestation must be done in a timely manner. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I'll tweet about reforestation, and I'll have people respond like, why are you even bothering with that? It's climate change. Why are you bothering to replant? And I try to take pains to explain to people that there's still plenty of great reforestation happening throughout the state. You just have to kind of know what you're doing, follow understood practices. Our industrial forestry colleagues are actively replanting successfully in many locations. So climate change is a challenge, but it's not a barrier to reforestation. And it requires fewer resources if it's done sooner. I showed you those huge shrubs, and on the right in the previous picture, 10 years later, there's lots of debris. It takes a lot of funding and time to remove debris and cut and beat back the competing vegetation. So timely and well-done reforestation will make a huge impact of getting forests back, which is a huge goal of our state for carbon sequestration and a lot of our climate goals in the future. Shrubs are great. They don't sequester as much carbon, and they're not where a lot of the wildlife species evolved over time. So a forest probably should be in a lot of places that we are not working hard to reforest. Here are some of the steps for reforestation. You need to order tree seedlings to be grown in a nursery. If you have enough seed trees, you could do that, but in a lot of these areas of high severity, you don't have that. Removing dead trees and woody debris, so you reduce the fuels. I showed you the second burn and third burn. If you can try and stop that, then you have the ability to have your young trees grow. Planting trees and then controlling vegetation that may compete with the trees until they overtop them. Those are all important steps, and they need to be done fairly quickly after a wildfire. Here's some pictures of removing dead trees. These trees have been cut down. They're going to be put on a log truck. They're going to be taken to a mill. They are merchantable, means they're large enough. Some private family landowners may be able to do salvage logging, make an income, and use that to clean up the site and replant. But generally after a wildfire, the markets are really bad. Industrial timber companies are also having burns happen, and they want to use their own logs in their own mill. So they're not going to get to you if you're a small private landowner for your logs. So I've seen people benefit from that, so they have funding to reforest, but it's not a given, and it depends on the market. And then removing woody debris is called site prep. In that top picture, The merchantable trees have been taken out, but there's still a lot of scrubby stuff there. It doesn't all have to be removed. Having some dead wood and patches, and variety is good for wildlife habitat. But basically, within the first 2 years, you want to do something with all that submerchantable material and all the leftover debris from the trees that you have pulled out. And then if you don't, here's a site where nothing was done to replant or deal with competing vegetation. So that's deer brush there on the Kingfire. And I think you can see that's fairly lush and dense. And in that situation, trees would have a very hard time competing both for moisture and for light and are not necessarily going to win. So if that bottom side is to be planted, there has to be something done with all that vegetation. Okay, and then planting trees, that's the sexy part. That's the easiest part to fund. It may take several times over several years to get to the density that you want. As an aside, we're definitely not planting as densely as we used to. In industrial timberlands, we used to plant 400 or so trees to the acre. Now they're down to 300 or so. On private lands, I'm seeing people plant 100, 150. And it's an understanding that in the past we thought we would do all this management and get in and thin out all those extra trees. And now there's an understanding we barely are able to do that, especially on public lands. So that is, we're not advocating for planting them everywhere at high densities so that they're going to be a problem, but enough so there would be a forest left. And then controlling that vegetation is key, and that's a step that's often missed. And the tools would be grubbing by hand with a hoe, making scalps around your tree. Grazing can be used, and herbicide actually is a key component of being successful. And a lot of the Forest Service failed plantations that I've seen had to do with the lack of being able to use herbicide on Forest Service land. Herbicide is not a popular tool. I guess just to frame it for you, I would say in forestry it might be used 1 or 2 times over 80 to 100 years, as opposed to in agriculture and the food you eat, where it's often used annually. So I really feel that we need to have an evolution of our attitudes around herbicide because it's a really important tool for reforestation, and it's going to need to be used if we want to reforest landscapes. I feel like we made that breakthrough with invasive weeds maybe 10 or 15 years ago. The first time I ever met anyone who thought herbicides was okay was people who were working hard on getting rid of invasive weeds, star thistle, things like that. I feel like we need to get there now with reforestation, or we're going to not be successful in many cases. Other tools work, but they cost more, and they can't be used at the scale that we need to be used. This one on the right at the bottom, that's a tree. It has some competing vegetation. No herbicide was used, but grubbing was used. It was about a 30-acre plot, and so it was successful. But if you're replanting thousands of acres, you're not going to be successful without some herbicide use. Okay, so for private landowners, there's a lack of knowledge. What do? I've just been burnt out. There's a lack of funding. I told you it's expensive. Some people may actually be able to get income, but I would say it's a minority. There's not many contractors out there. There's a lack of seedlings. And then there's other pressing needs. A lot of people have had their homes burned. They've had to move away. It's very difficult to fit this priority into your personal trauma of moving forward. So I was lucky enough to partner with my local resource conservation district and do a research project on landowners affected by wildfires in a fire on the West Slope. We did an interview qualitative research project. We had open-ended semi-structured interviews. We did analysis of what people told us, and we coded it. We came out, we published this paper in the Journal of Forestry. And we asked people how the wildfires that they experienced were affecting them. So I just wanted to start with the emotional impact. Sarah McCaffrey is a research forester for the Forest Service, and she helped coin the term solastalgia. If you're familiar with the word nostalgia, it's sadness about the past, right? So solastalgia is now sadness about the loss of solace that the landscape used to provide for you. If you are a rural person and there's not a lot of people or things to do, the landscape is a big source of your emotional support. It provides you solace. So not just losing your homes, your structures, your businesses, it's also very sad and traumatic. And a lot of people we talked to really discussed returning forests and emotional healing in the same phrases. A lot of people said they wanted to put it back the way it was. It was really connected to emotional healing as well. Those are some quotes from the people we talked to. You can see they say, my house mattered, but I'm really upset about those trees. I used to live in a forest. This is sitting on one of their porches, so you can see instead of a dense forest, you have a big open area now. So it's a huge change in your environment. Everybody we talked to wanted to reforest. They may have wanted to do it to lesser extents, not all their acres. They might want to pasture, but everyone wanted to do it. They all gave interesting different reasons about it. Maybe it was air quality, some people would say. But those are the things that they mentioned, and they wanted to put it back. There's a quote, "We want everything back. It won't ever be like it was, but we want to do as much as we can to make it as close as possible." And some good understanding from some of the long-term rural residents. If we were to just leave it alone, it would be a brush field of manzanita and ceanothus. Not whitethorn, that's too lower elevation. Very little environment for the larger wildlife like bears and deer. So I think a timber environment or a forest, which was a natural environment prior to the fire, is the right way to go in recovery. So people really do want to reestablish forests, everybody that I talk to. But they need help. They may not know how to do it. The people I talked to in this research had been benefitors of a free, no-cost reforestation program. A local organization applied for a CAL FIRE Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund grant and was able to come in to their property. They only had to sign a right of entry that said, you can work on my property. And they hired the contractors, they handled everything, and they got the steps taken care of for the landowner. Which was a huge benefit to those people. We asked them, what would you have done without this program? And a third of them said, I would have done nothing at all. About a third of the acres that were burned. I don't know how, I can't do it, I'm old, I'm disabled, I'm on a low income. We had people with 5 acres on pretty low incomes out there in the woods. A third said they would have tried to do it themselves. That first quote, I probably would have selected small, high-value areas, nuked the weeds somehow, and planted 20 trees one summer and 20 the next. And a third said that they understood enough about forestry to have applied for standard landowner assistance programs. But I concluded that without this kind of area approach, where we are helping landowners on an area basis rather than making them come to a normal assistance program that is doing one thing here and one project there, that probably got at least a third more acres reforested by having this response program. So that's affected a lot of how I think about reforestation with small private landowners. I have been participating in California's governor's wildfire resilience and forest task force. I've been participating since 2015 when it was a tree mortality task force. This was people in government getting together, trying to coordinate funding for tree removal. In 2018, a forest management task force. Now it's the wildfire resilience task force. Now we have a lot of funding going in. That's a picture of the plan. And there's a treatment goal for the state of California and a whole work group on reforestation. So I've been fortunate to get some funding from that. I helped found the Forest Stewardship Workshop Series that were funded completely by Cal FAR at this point. It was funded in 2019. We were just awarded the best comprehensive forest landowner education program in the country by the National Woodland Owners Association. We've had 450 people go through it, and we're doing it all over the state. On the upper right is what they're learning, management plans and processes and regulations, not as much about how trees grow, but like how to actually get from here to there. Here's some photos of our groups. We made this cool tree stick. It's called the California Tree Stick, and it's got lots of information on it. We give it as a little swag to the people who go through our class. And after the class, they say that they really want to consult with a registered professional forester and talk to CAL FIRE, apply for cost share funding, try and manage their landscape. Based on that, we just last year started a post-fire forest resilience education program that was funded by the Forest Service. And what we're doing is helping them understand all those steps that I described to you. It's a 7-week Zoom session with field trips. We're on our 3rd cohort. We've had about 100 people go through. We went to the Dixie Fire, Caldor Fire, Tamarack Fire. Next month, we're going to the Creek Fire and the Oak Fire. And we're making our way around the state. Here's some pictures. That's the town of Greenville in the upper left. It was all burned, so there's some pop-up businesses where you can meet and drink coffee and look at how different treatments have been done in these sites. Here's the Caldor field trip we took. There's a lot of dead trees everywhere, and the Tamarack Fire in Alpine County. I just wanted to show you a few outcomes. Basically, we're trying to increase participant knowledge and intention to conduct reforestation. We're getting lots of interesting different types of folks. About 35% are private landowners, but then there's lots of agency people showing up who feel they want to learn about reforestation. We have a lot of new young people going into forestry, which is fabulous because we have new jobs, and they're showing up so that they can learn about forestry. And then the upper graph is knowledge, what they feel they know more about afterwards is in orange. So control of competing vegetation, erosion control, that shows you how many people feel they know a lot more about it. And then the bottom one is how many people say they're likely to do these management projects. So the one I'm most proud of is that second one, controlling competing vegetation. Twice as many people afterwards understand the role of that and plan to do that when they're replanting. And then I just wanted to give a couple of overviews of this model now. I described to you the project I was able to interview people for, which was kind of an emergency approach to post-fire. And so now the state of California has funded this concept that we came up with in one of the task force work groups, the emergency forest restoration teams. And the goal is to rapidly get people out there to help assess where assistance is needed and fund reforestation on our non-industrial lands. So a lot of agencies are collaborating, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Farm Services agencies, CAL FIRE, the Forest Service, and these are locations where they're piloting this concept. What if we moved a bunch of people, a bunch of money there right away to help people reforest right away, as opposed to how we've done assistance programs in the past when forestry was more well-planned and you could think your trees wouldn't all burn down, you might just have a nice orderly planning process. So these are the folks who are receiving the funds, the resource conservation districts in those locations, and they have new programs like the one I described, specifically focused to help people reforest quickly and deal with dead trees. Our role in UCANR, we're partners. We're going and doing our workshops in these locations to help with the educational outreach. And we're just started a whole series of key informant interviews with implementers of the new EFRTs to ask them what's working and what's not working. After a few treatments happen from these 2021 fires, we're going to be interviewing landowners about their experience, and then we're going to be doing some ecological monitoring of the success of the reforestation. So our goal is to come out with a lessons learned document on the success and how to move forward with this new approach to emergency forest restoration teams. That's it for me. Happy to take any questions.